Welcome back to the Martian podcast, where we unpack the complex events shaping our world. Today, we're diving deep into three major stories that have dominated headlines: the devastating weather events across the U.S., the cybersecurity breach at the U.S. Treasury Department, and the Biden administration's final sanctions on Russia. I'm your host, AI SenseCheck, and joining us today is our expert analyst, Sophie. Sophie, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Mr. SenseCheck. Always a pleasure. These are definitely critical topics that deserve our attention.
Well, let's start with the cyber attack on the U.S. Treasury. This seems like a major incident. Can you break down what happened?
Absolutely. In December 2024, the U.S. Treasury Department was hit by a significant cyber attack that's been attributed to Chinese state-sponsored hackers. The hackers managed to infiltrate the Treasury's systems by exploiting a vulnerability in a third-party software vendor called Beyond Trust, which provides remote technical support. This is a huge deal because it highlights how vulnerable even government agencies can be through their supply chains.
So it wasn't a direct attack on the Treasury itself, but through a third party?
Exactly. The attackers compromised an API key that Beyond Trust used to secure its cloud-based services. This allowed them to bypass security measures, remotely access Treasury Departmental Office user workstations, and steal unclassified documents. This highlights a critical weakness in supply chain security. If a third-party vendor is compromised, it can open a backdoor into even the most secure networks.
What parts of the Treasury were affected?
The attack hit multiple offices, but notably it impacted the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. OFAC is responsible for administering and enforcing foreign sanctions, making it a prime target for espionage. The Office of the Treasury Secretary and the Office of Financial Research were also compromised. Think about the sensitivity of information in these departments. Adversaries are likely seeking details on U.S. economic strategies and potential future sanctions.
And how did Beyond Trust respond to this?
Beyond Trust, which is a U.S.-based firm specializing in privileged identity management and remote access services, said it identified an incident affecting a limited number of their customers. They found that the breach stemmed from a compromised API key in their remote support SaaS offering. They revoked the key immediately and notified affected users, including the Treasury. They also identified two vulnerabilities, one critical and one medium severity, related to command injection. These have since been patched.
What about the U.S. government's response?
The Treasury Department is working with CISA, the FBI, and other investigators to determine the full extent of the incident. They've classified this as a major cybersecurity incident. The government is very concerned about the security of federal systems and the data they hold.
What has been China's response to these accusations?
The Chinese government has vehemently denied any involvement, calling the accusations groundless and a smear campaign. They have stated that China opposes all forms of hacking and accused the U.S. of using cybersecurity as a way to vilify China. This denial adds another layer of complexity to the ongoing tensions between the U.S. and China, especially in the cyber domain.
This all sounds incredibly serious. What's the bigger picture here?
This incident really highlights the escalating cyber conflicts between the U.S. and China. Both countries have accused each other of cyber espionage and attacks on critical infrastructure for years. The U.S. has alleged that China uses cyber attacks to steal trade secrets, compromise government communications, and disrupt economies. The Treasury breach underscores how easily these attacks can occur through third-party vulnerabilities, making cybersecurity a continuous challenge.
Let's move to the big story, the devastating weather events in the U.S. What can you tell us about those?
Early 2025 has been marked by significant weather disasters across the U.S., including tornadoes in the south and massive wildfires in California. These events have caused widespread destruction, displacement, and a tragic loss of life.
To start with California, the wildfires seem particularly devastating.
Absolutely. California, specifically Los Angeles County, has been battling major wildfires, including the Palisades and Eaton fires. These fires forced nearly 200,000 people to evacuate. The fires have destroyed entire neighborhoods and left thousands homeless. The death toll has already reached at least 11 people, and sadly, officials fear that number could rise.
What fueled these fires?
The fires were caused by a combination of several factors. We had drought-like conditions, with Southern California experiencing less than 10% of average rainfall since October. This created extremely dry conditions. Combine that with low humidity and very strong Santa Ana winds, and you get a recipe for disaster. The National Weather Service even issued red flag warnings indicating elevated fire danger. There are also indications that some of the fires may have been caused by arson.
And what about the impact of these fires?
The impact is immense. We're talking about insured losses potentially exceeding $20 billion, and the total economic losses could hit $50 billion. This would make it the most expensive fire in U.S. history. The fires have devastated communities, with many people losing their homes and belongings. There were also many challenges for firefighters, including downed power lines, gas leaks, and even unauthorized drones flying over the fire zones. One drone even collided with a firefighting aircraft, grounding it for needed repairs.
Any updates on the statements by the authorities?
California Governor Gavin Newsom has called for an independent investigation into the loss of water pressure affecting fire hydrants during the ongoing wildfires in Los Angeles. This decision comes in response to alarming reports that inadequate water supplies have severely hampered firefighting efforts, particularly during the Palisades fire, which has devastated large areas and led to significant property damage and loss of life. The Palisades fire, which began on January 7, 2025, has burned tens of thousands of acres and destroyed numerous structures. Firefighters faced extreme challenges due to high winds and dry conditions, which exacerbated the situation. Reports indicated that many fire hydrants in the affected areas were either dry or had insufficient water pressure, complicating efforts to control the flames. In some instances, firefighters resorted to using unconventional methods, such as buckets from pools, to combat the fires, due to the lack of available water from hydrants.
And the tornadoes in the south?
Yes. While California was dealing with fires, several southern states were hit by multiple tornadoes, causing extensive damage across the region. These storms led to severe infrastructure damage and widespread power outages. Thousands of people were displaced, and the federal government had to step in, with President Biden declaring states of emergency in some areas, which enabled federal assistance for recovery efforts.
These events highlight the increasing threat of extreme weather. What's the broader takeaway here?
These weather events are a stark reminder of the growing impact of climate change. The conditions that fueled the California fires, drought, and high winds are becoming increasingly common. The intensity and frequency of extreme weather are increasing, putting more and more communities at risk. It is very clear that we need improved disaster preparedness and response strategies as these weather patterns worsen.
Let's move on to our final topic, the Biden administration's sanctions on Russia. What's the background here?
In response to Russia's ongoing actions in Ukraine, the Biden administration imposed a broad package of sanctions on Russia's energy sector just before leaving office in January 2025. These sanctions are designed to cut off funding for Moscow's war efforts and provide leverage for future negotiations.
What specific targets did these sanctions hit?
The sanctions primarily focused on Russia's oil and gas revenues, hitting Russian oil companies, vessels, and energy infrastructure. Specifically, Gazprom, Neftegas, major Russian oil producers, along with their subsidiaries, were sanctioned. Over 180 oil-carrying vessels, many from Russia's shadow fleet, were targeted. Sanctions were placed on Russia's liquefied natural gas production and export. Restrictions were imposed on financial institutions and service providers that facilitate Russian energy transactions. 2 Indian companies, Skyheart Management Services and Avision Management Services, were sanctioned for allegedly violating sanctions by transporting LNG from Russia.
And what is the intended impact of these sanctions?
The Biden administration is hoping these sanctions will cripple Russia's economy by cutting off a major source of funding for the war. They are also meant to provide the incoming Trump administration and Ukraine with leverage in future negotiations. The U.S. has also provided Ukraine with $64 billion in military aid since the start of the invasion. The sanctions are intended to weaken the Russian economy, which is already facing challenges like high inflation and a weak ruble.
How might these sanctions affect the global energy markets?
There was an immediate impact, with oil prices jumping as soon as the sanctions were announced. However, the U.S. has also stated it is now the world's largest producer of oil. They feel global oil supplies are in a better position now than earlier in the war. New oil volumes from the U.S., Guyana, Canada, and Brazil, and potentially the Middle East, are also expected to help fill in any lost Russian supply.
What has been Russia's response and how effective do you expect these sanctions to be?
Russia has called these sanctions unjustified and illegitimate. They will also likely attempt to circumvent the measures. However, U.S. officials have said that any circumvention efforts will create inefficiencies and higher costs for Russia. The enforcement of these sanctions will be the key. The long-term impact remains to be seen as the Trump administration takes office.
Speaking of the Trump administration, what will be their role with these sanctions?
That's a crucial question. The incoming Trump administration will have to decide whether to enforce, lift, or modify these sanctions. Trump has expressed that he wants to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. He has used sanctions aggressively before while in office, but he's also voiced concerns about the impact of sanctions on the dollar. So his next steps are very uncertain. It's worth noting that if Trump tries to lift these sanctions, he will need to notify Congress, who would have the option to take a vote of disapproval. So what is your overall takeaway from all of these events?
These three major stories really highlight the complex, interconnected challenges the world faces right now. The cyber attack on the Treasury shows the importance of robust cybersecurity measures and supply chain management, especially when dealing with state-sponsored actors. The weather events are a stark reminder of the growing impact of climate change and the need for improved disaster preparedness. The sanctions on Russia reveal the delicate balance of geopolitics and the economic challenges the world is facing in the context of ongoing conflicts. It's clear that these are critical issues that require ongoing monitoring and discussion. Thank you, Sophie, for your insightful analysis.
My pleasure, sir.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on the Martian podcast. We will continue to bring you more stories. Please subscribe to our channel if you like this video and put down your valuable comments below. I am AI SenseCheck, and this is the Martian podcast.